Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hello, listeners, and welcome back. This week, we are going to talk about raising resilient children. So it's kind of an offshoot of what we talked about last week in effective parenting. But we're going to talk about how to help children be resilient as they grow up. And one of the things that we're going to hit on is dealing with childhood trauma and how to help children be resilient in that. But we also want to talk about helping children to be resilient in life, because as we all know, change is inevitable and change can be incredibly difficult for children. So how do we help them better adapt? How do we help them to be more resilient?
It's such a great thing for parents to think about.
It really is.
How do you do that? I had this reaction as I was thinking about, talking about this tonight, and I got excited, and I'm trying to figure out why was I excited about this? Mm-hmm. And I think it's because if parents really listen to these suggestions, because I'm going to go through quite a few different suggestions on how you might help children learn to be resilient. Mm-hmm. I think it can make a huge difference in kids' lives. Mm-hmm. And so hopefully, parents will take some of these things, try and implement them into their own families. And I think it can be helpful. All of these things, are going to be very helpful for kids. I have a book that I want to recommend. And
absolutely.
Usually when I get going, I forget about the books. So I want to get it out at the start.
Yeah.
Here's the name of it is called The Yes Brain. Okay. How to Cultivate Courage, Curiosity, and Resilience in Your Child. Okay. And I think it's a great book, but the main reason I love the author's name is Daniel Siegel, Siegel. Okay. And Dan Siegel by training, he's an adolescent psychiatrist at UCLA. But I think he's one of our country's foremost experts on the brain and how to change it, how to have a healthy brain. And then he incorporates all that vast knowledge about the brain and how it works into how do you have healthy relationships. Mm-hmm. So I think his books, he's written quite a few books. I can't remember the last one was specifically about adolescents, but if you go search for Dan Siegel's name, I think any of his books are really quite helpful. Okay. So resilience, why were we even talking about this? And so if we talk about, you mentioned childhood trauma, but then, life is stressful and there are other events other than just trauma that can be difficult for children. And I think back when we talked about anxiety, which we've talked about several times, it's really important to understand the brain changes that happen when you're under threat, and then the physiological changes that happens when one is under threat. And so what happens is your body goes through these changes, which are designed to make us faster and stronger and more alert and more capable. And so, for instance, our heart rate increases, our blood pressure goes up, adrenaline and cortisol, I think I've mentioned that, start flooding our body. And all of that is to get our body and our mind prepared to act in some way to save us.
It's the fight or fight response.
It's exactly that. It's a fight or flight response. So in the short term, so for an immediate issue, it's really helpful. Mm-hmm. Oh, and the additional thing, the brain thing, is often our executive function is in our frontal lobe. And what we call executive function is how we make decisions and things like that. We're thinking out problems. And often what happens is that actually gets turned off. And we think that the reason in the short term, and the reason for that is that maybe when you need to run or you need to fight, you don't want to sit and think about it and, have some sort of internal discussion with yourself about, should I do this? Should I do that? I think sometimes you just need to act.
And I had a very recent experience with that. We were at a family barbecue and my son, who is almost 2, he started choking. And at first it was kind of like, we were watching him because he was still getting air. He was kind of doing that thing where, they're choking, but they're Yeah. And so eventually I could see that he wasn't getting any air. And I didn't even think. I just immediately reacted because I've been through a lot of training for how to help an infant or a young child choking. And just without even thinking about it, I leaned his head forward and I banged on his back. And he got it up and got it out. Yeah. But I really think it was that fight or flight response. I mean, just I didn't even think, I just acted.
Right. And you're exactly right. That's what it is. You know, I always think, as much as I know about the brain and how it interacts with the body, I think it's such an amazing system, really.
Yeah,
the way
it
our brain
really
works.
is.
So, you know, your description of that event, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So now the problem comes, though, if the stress is prolonged, then all those things, adrenaline, especially cortisol, heart rate going up, blood pressure going up, that is not good for the body.
Right.
And I think I mentioned during several talks about anxiety that, you know, in the center of your brain, the amygdala is the thing that gets triggered. And so even though this isn't, and I'm going to say again, this isn't what really happens, I always envision the amygdala as being inflamed in some way. And so it's easily like, you're easily startled, you're easily upset, and all those, that's the anxiety. That's the, you know, kids that grow up and they're anxious. And so one of the reasons that we want to talk about resiliency is to help children learn how to better handle the issues that come through them with life. And sometimes it's going to be traumatic events. That's true. But as you mentioned, there are all sorts of changes. Because if you're triggered easily, if your amygdala, you know, is easily triggered, then, you know, going to a new school, like when you change to go to middle school or when you go to high school, that can be a triggering event that then causes the child to be anxious. And the resilient child doesn't react in that same way. So that's the reason to talk about resiliency.
And I think it starts with, and I've heard this before, I've had another therapist tell me this, that it starts with, as a very young child, how you react to things like when they fall over or when they become injured.
Sure.
It kind of starts there. So, for example, if babies trip a lot and kids they're going to fall over, they're going to bleed, they're going to get hurt. How do you handle a bleeding child? Do you run around and freak out like a chicken with its head cut off?
Right.
Or do you remain calm?
Okay. So as a new parent, so this would be about 41 years ago. My oldest child is 41. I remember where she was in a tub and she slipped and I guess she must have bit a lip or tongue or something. Anyway, she started bleeding, right? Because those are bleeders.
Yeah.
So our first child, and I kid you not, we're in the car going to the hospital.
No.
Yeah. So, you know, that's an overreaction.
Right.
But we figured out, okay, that's an overreaction. And somehow maybe we took ice and the ice, you know, she's sucking on the ice and it stops the bleeding. Anyway, so you bring up a really good point. And that is that there are going to be childhood accidents and how we react as parents. And I would say it's the intensity with which we react.
Yes.
It's because the kids will pick up on that. And I think, again, this goes back to anxiety. And I, you know, threw out the idea at one time that anxiety is not necessarily what we inherit. It's what we're taught. And there's some pretty good evidence that that is true. And so, you know, if your child, you know, you've got this little child and they pick up everything and they witness you being anxious. Oh, is he going to fall? Is he going to hurt? Or did he, you know, he scraped his leg? Then you're right. It teaches them to be anxious and that falling and hurting yourself is somehow a bigger deal
than it really is.
Maybe it really is.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go through a list of things, and maybe this is the reason I was really looking forward to and excited about talking about this. I think, you know, and the listeners probably know that anytime we're talking about childhood issues, I always talk to Lindy about it, my wife, because she, and so this is the very first thing I said, what do you know about resiliency in kids? The very first thing she said, if you have a strong relationship with just one person, if the child has a strong relationship with just one person, that is you. You know, often parents think, well, I want to raise this independent child, but it's not that you want them to be independent before they're able to be independent. Mm-hmm. There's this fine line between helping too much and not helping enough.
Very fine.
Yeah. And it's hard to figure that out. Mm-hmm. But I think the research is pretty clear on this, that if you have people around you who care about you, who are there to help you. Now, this is typically parents, right? Or grandparents. It doesn't have to be. I mean, it could be a teacher. Sometimes teachers are that way. And, they're the people who are really supportive, but it's that social support with that emotional component. I think we talked about this, John Gottman's emotion coaching, and how you talk to kids and really promote emotional awareness. And so if you're the parent who's there, who's ready to support their kids in any way they can. Now, that does not mean you do something for them. And that's actually something I'll get to in a minute. It's just you're there when they need that support. And you don't run in and solve their problems for them immediately, because that's another issue we'll talk about, is you want them to learn what we might call self-efficacy.
Yeah.
And so again, it's a fine line. I mean, it's tough for parents. I mean, I gave you the example of my oldest child, and we're on the way to the hospital with the, bit lip. Yeah. And that's it.
Yeah.
So that's a little overkill.
Right. And as you're speaking, I'm thinking of when a toddler gets hurt, because they fall a lot and they scrape their knee or whatever, and how we react. A lot of parents, it's instinctive to run to the child and comfort them and just, are you okay? Are you okay? Are you okay?
Yeah.
When really the better way to do it is, oh, did you get hurt? And acknowledge that they're hurt, stay calm, and comfort them in whatever way they need comfort. And that way they feel seen, they feel heard. Someone is acknowledging, I'm feeling something, but you're not just amplifying it. That's a
really good way to put it. Don't amplify it, but it's empathy for the emotional reaction. Mm-hmm. So before we leave that one, the research says that, it's not necessarily the inner strength of the child or that rugged self-reliance. It is the reliable presence of at least one supportive relationship. Mm-hmm. That's the important thing.
Yeah.
In the context of a loving relationship with an adult who helps the child to develop those coping skills. Mm-hmm. So having someone who cares about them is really important. Now, the next thing is, it's okay to help children learn. It's okay to ask for help.
Right. Yeah.
When they need it, because if you go throughout life, I mean, if you think about, life experiences, if we try and do them on our own, that's hard. It's overwhelming. But if in the times we need help, we can find someone and ask for help, then again, you have that presence of someone who's there to support you. And that's really helpful for being resilient.
Mm-hmm. So let's take a minute and talk about something that can be really hard: the importance of never lying to a child, which seems kind of odd.
I agree with that.
Because there's kind of cultural, social things that we do talk about, and parents will know exactly what I'm talking about. Cultural things that around Christmas or losing a first tooth, those kinds of things, like, they kind of understand. And I mean, that kind of makes it almost like, okay, this seems backwards. And maybe some parents think that, well, if we're lying to them about that, then why isn't it okay to lie to them about other things? I've heard this one thing on Facebook one time that said, when my parents learn how to read, I'm going to be in all sorts of trouble, because when they ask me what that sign says, I tell them things like, no talking to your brother, or, don't hit. They're just telling little white lies to help get through that moment. Or if you eat too many gummy bears, you're going to turn into one, is one that I heard my friend say, which was kind of just a silly thing. And I don't think, I think kids kind of know when you're just being silly. But I think that it's very, very important to never lie to a child as much as you possibly can.
I agree. And so you bring up an interesting point. In fact, one of my daughters thought that they should tell the reality around Santa Claus. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I think their kids actually believe, because the problem with that, yes, it's a lie. But if you then tell them that Santa Claus isn't real, then you set them up to be different than every other kid in their class.
Yeah.
And that in and of itself is really, really tough. And then you set them up to be disliked by all the other parents when they go around telling their kids that Santa Claus isn't real. So I think I always put those two. Easter Bunny might be one, Tooth Fairy might be one. I put those in a little bit different category because they are social norms.
Yes.
And honestly, I have never seen anyone who came into my office and said, I am traumatized because my parents lied to me about Santa Claus. I've never seen it. So I feel like I was not traumatized by that.
I wasn't angry at my parents and it was just kind of this sudden dawning realization. Like I grew up, my brain developed, and I'm like, this doesn't make sense. Okay, this is what it really is. And I moved on with life, and I wasn't mad at anyone. And
that's right. So listen, I want to acknowledge there may be people out there who had a traumatic experience with that. I have not met them yet, though. So going back to the original idea, I think it's really important not to lie to children. And I think the reason parents do is they don't know how to talk to kids about certain subjects that on a more age appropriate level. And so that in the presence of, I don't know what to do, then they just decide, well, I'm going to lie about it. I agree with you. If you're lying about the sign and the kid says, what does that sign say? And you lie about it, the kid's going to find out. And that's very different than the issue of Santa Claus. Right. So asking for help is really important. The next thing we talked at the start about executive function. And so the idea of it's essentially how do you problem solve? Right. And so one of the things that I think you mentioned this earlier in this episode, and that is not for parents to jump in and do things for the kids. So, and I may have mentioned this before, when Lindy's in the playroom, often she'll have children who will go to her and say, here, I can't do this, whatever this is. Can you help me? And her response is I think it's always the same. I know you can figure that out. Okay. And so it's saying, to the child, you can figure this out. Now, certainly, again, parents have to use their better judgment. If the child's trying to do something that clearly they are never going to be able to figure out, then you need to step in and help them and teach them. But if in your mind it's clearly something they can do, if they just put forth the effort, then you help them to do that. And you say, you're able to do that. And then the response when they're able to, like even taking a lid off of a jar, and then you say, see, I knew you could do that. I'm really happy that you were successful.
So what do you do then when you run into, because I know I have as a parent, when the child's able to do something, but they want you to do it for them anyways. So where is that line of, well, I know you can do this, but you want me to. And so where's that line at?
Well, I think that parents often jump in and do things just because it's quicker.
Right. That's true too.
So I understand that, but I think if what you're trying to do is build self-efficacy with your children, then you need to stand back and let it take the time. Good parenting often takes more time than we really want to spend, right? And so it takes a lot of patience and to just say, child, I know you can do this. And so we'll just wait till you do this. And so if you step in, then they know that they don't have to,
do hard things.
Yeah, do hard things, and that they can do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Which then eventually translates into, I think, schoolwork.
Yes.
So as your kids get older and they have homework, I have heard so many parents say they go in and they do the report for the kid. And I think that is the worst thing. One of the worst things school-wise that you can do for kids is because then, they learn that they don't have to do it themselves.
And another thing that parents do that I've heard teachers talk about is not making sure they go to school with every correct answer. In that if they're doing it on their own and they get it wrong, you don't have to correct it in the home. And I'm not talking about practically doing it for them. I'm talking about, when they're doing it independently and they get something wrong, maybe let it stay wrong. So the teacher, the teacher knows it's okay for kids
to make
fail
mistakes.
To get it wrong. I think that's a really hard thing for parents to understand. And I know I struggle with it too, is letting kids make mistakes, letting them get it wrong, letting them fail. Home should be a safe environment for kids to fail and rebuild up self-esteem.
Right.
It's one of those things where it's kind of like every child gets a trophy. At a certain age, it's like, yeah, when they're really young, okay, we don't need to keep score. There doesn't need to be a defined winner or loser when they're really young and just learning. But eventually, when they get to a certain age, there needs to be a winner because kids need to learn how to lose.
Well, because that's real life.
Exactly.
That's life.
Yes.
And so I agree with you that it's okay for kids to fail. In fact, I tell parents all the time, you want your kids to fail because then they know what it's like, and they then can pick themselves up and figure out how do you solve what this failure is, whatever it is. And so I think we get so caught up as parents in thinking my kids have to be perfect or 100%. And, the math quiz they take home in third grade is going to somehow determine where they go to graduate school. And
really not.
There is just no connection at all. So let your kids fail and be there to help. Like if they come and say, Dad, I don't understand how this works, then you can say, let's talk about it. See, that's a valid question. It's to say, I don't understand, how this thing, whatever it is, works. So it's a really good point. The next two things are things we have talked about before in the context of how do you help anxiety? And that is a good mindfulness practice. I mean, we call it, for adults, we call it, meditation, but an exercise. So it's really important, I think, to help kids learn the value of mindfulness. I would put in this category of how do you help kids learn to self-regulate? So self-regulation is something I think as all parents, that's what we want our kids to learn so that they, they're in school and something happens. They don't just, explode and lose their crap all over the place, And so you want them to learn how to control the emotions. And I think they do that at home. But I also think if you can teach them a good mindfulness practice, and there are good meditative programs out there on the internet for kids. And I can tell you that Lindy has done this with all four of my grandkids. At times she'll get them together and they'll do a circle meditation. I mean, there are things that are appropriate for children and they love it. They really like it. So it's not that kids are going to push back. Most kids are not going to push back against this, especially if you're doing it with them.
Okay. Yeah. I've heard of yoga, having kids do yoga. I've heard that they love that. They love doing yoga. They think that's fun. So, which could be meditative.
My youngest is always doing downward dog or whatever. I don't know the different positions. So good exercise is appropriate. And so I'm not saying, you take your kids on a 5-mile run. I'm saying you teach them how to play kickball. You go play soccer, you go play basketball, or something that gets them being active that is also enjoyable. And it also builds relationship with the parent.
Yes. Get them outside. Get them outside with your kids.
Go on a hike. Kids, they may grumble about it, but still go on a hike, do something, walk. Yeah. So those things are really important. Now, the next thing we've kind of covered, building feelings of competence and a sense of mastery. This is something that we've known for a long time and really worked with our kids. And you may be aware of this, that if a child, so especially when they hit adolescence, if they have one thing that they really feel like is their thing. For instance, I'm a piano player. I'm a soccer player. I'm a singer. I sing. And it really doesn't matter what it is. And they can have more than one thing. But if they have one thing that they feel like they are mastering, that is really important for kids because it helps give them that sense of mastery. And it really ties on accomplishment in it. And what you're doing is, let's say, just playing the piano or learning to play the guitar. And that is, you're taking something that's hard, you're working at it, hopefully daily or weekly, and you're practicing. And so over time, really maybe it's not a subtle way, maybe it's not so subtle, is that you're teaching the kid, I can do this hard thing and become better.
And it builds self-esteem too.
That's resiliency.
Yeah, I could really see that building self-esteem because they're doing something that they can be proud of. I mean, they can
Mm-hmm.
see, wow, like for example, playing the piano. This song used to be really, really hard, and now I can
Now
play and
it's
it's
not.
easy.
Yeah.
That sounds really effective.
Yeah. So I'm teaching all four of my grandkids piano right now. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know that I'm a great teacher, but they love it. And it's exactly that.
And
I
they
can
love
give them,
spending time with you as
yeah. And so
well,
they all
too.
spend time with me. So next thing is certainly modeling resiliency as a parent.
Mm-hmm.
Now, sometimes that, that might be hard given the context, but let's say, oh, for instance, the adult, maybe they're trying to get a job and they don't get it. The
Mm-hmm.
way you react to that, if you're resilient or not, can
Mm-hmm.
be a good example for your children. For
Okay.
example, if it's devastating and okay, it's the end of the world, I didn't get this job. Well, that's not being resilient.
Or if
But
they get fired from a job.
if you get fired from a job,
Mm-hmm.
that's
Yeah.
very difficult. But
Uh-huh.
you can take that and use it as an opportunity as to how one is resilient by
Okay.
modeling, okay, yeah, I got fired, but I'm going to go start looking for a job right now. And here's what I'm going to do. And so you start that process and you can let the kids see,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, okay, dad or mom's facing a hard thing and they're going to come out on the other end. I mean, that's modeling is really important
Mm-hmm.
for children.
Yeah.
So, we've talked about, let's see, taking risks.
Okay.
Now, this is another one of those hard ones, which is a judgment call, right, for
Mm-hmm.
parents. When is the risk too big? So you don't want to let or encourage your children to take risks that are too big or that might be too dangerous or where there's a higher chance of failing. Although remember, failure is fine. It's just you want to help them learn to take risks that they have a decent chance of being successful.
Okay.
And what that means to take risks is I'm going to try this. I'm going to try it. I don't know if it'll work, but I'm going to give it, a try anyway. And so that's an important skill to have.
So, and an example that I may be thinking of is when a kid is learning to do something physical, like maybe learning to swim or swinging or doing something that physically can be dangerous or a little bit dangerous.
A little scary for him.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, going down a slide for a young toddler or learning to swim, it can also be a big one. That's a risk and there are dangers involved and you have to know your child and you have to make a judgment call of how much your child can handle. I guess in that case, because they need to know and understand you're going to be there. You're not going to let them drown,
well,
but they need to learn.
Yeah. The example of the slide, and maybe all of us who've had young kids have probably had the slide thing because kids are, you put them at the top of the slide and they don't want to go down the slide. And so you want them to learn that they can master that. And so you have to be able to, help them understand what it is and it's a risk, but it's a risk that'll be all right. And you can say, I'm going to be at the bottom to help you. And, after a while, they come down. And if you've had that experience, it's really fun to see the kid, all of a sudden, wow, I did it, and, it's just this little kid going down the slide. But that's a really good example of what you want to do as they grow up. It just changes. It's not the slide. It might be swimming. I know, sometimes you might have a fear of water. Well, let's figure out how to face your fear and let's, help you get through it.
Yeah. Right. All good things to talk about. So that is it for today. We are already out of time. Man, it just flies.
I can go on forever. And I know that I should have told you this. You can cut me off at any time. But I think these are really good ideas for parents to think about building a resilient child.
Yeah. And if anyone has any questions, as always, we're happy to take those. And next week, we're going to shift back a little bit to effective parenting. And we're going to talk about some common parenting problems, such as maybe around bedtime, getting kids to go to bed. And
that's a big one. I hear that all the time.
Yes. Or maybe, when parents are struggling to get kids to do homework or maybe with eating, those kinds of things. So stay tuned for that. It's going to be a good episode, and we will see you all next week. Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.